Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I'm going to talk about Godzilla Minus One. Last week I talked about wild cards and how they're upsetting the apple cart of Western entertainment. And I think that is exactly what Godzilla Minus One is. It was not intended to poke Hollywood in the eye and to show up its poor storytelling that is currently being produced, but that is exactly what it has done, and it has come at exactly the right time. Now, this is not a movie review. There are plenty of movie reviews out there for Godzilla Minus One now. What I'm going to do is talk about the story, really the bones of the story, but I will not be getting into any spoilers just in case you haven't seen the movie yet and plan to do so. Because really, the impact of this movie can be summed up in two words: good storytelling. But before we get there, and just to let everyone know, there are two links in the description and the pinned comment. They are for my 3 graphic novels. I have 2 superhero graphic novels that you can order at the Valiant Heroes Indiegogo site, and my low fantasy sword and sorcery graphic novel you can order through the Kron the Destroyer Indiegogo site. You're looking at some of the beautiful art for those in the background right now, and I'll let that speak for itself, except to say that my stories focus on the traditional ideas of good storytelling, heroism, and pure entertainment. So if any of that sounds or looks appealing to you at all, click on one of those links in the description and go on over and see if my graphic novels are for you. But back to the topic. Now, before I get into it, I have to admit right off the bat that I am a Godzilla fan. I have been a Godzilla fan for a long time. When the first trailer dropped for Godzilla Minus One, within less than a day I posted it on my social media saying, this is a movie I want to see, finally. And although I have not at this point seen all of the Godzilla movies, there was a point, probably around the early 80s, where I did see all of the Godzilla movies up to that point. There used to be this thing on the movie channels on cable back in the 80s where they did marathons of various kinds of movies. And at least once a year, they would do a marathon of Godzilla movies, showing every last one of them. And I would wait with anticipation for those days. So, you may accuse me of looking at this through rose-colored glasses, and you may be right, because I am indeed a Godzilla fan. And secondly, I wanted to point out the fact that my channel is based around the ideas of a true hero and very much the expression of that idea or ideal through storytelling, so I concentrate a lot on storytelling. And people over the years have asked me over and over again to compare Western storytelling and Eastern storytelling. And while I have shied away from that for the most part, doing only here and there small videos like the comparison of fight scenes between a North American comic book as compared to that in manga. But I have no excuse not to do that right now, because Godzilla Minus One is exactly the answer to the question of the difference between Eastern and Western storytelling, and the answer to why I was hesitant to actually do such a video. And the point is twofold. Number one, I am very much of the mind of the Will Eisner school of looking at storytelling, the idea that there are various kinds of literacy that people need to understand before they can fully comprehend what a story is trying to say. And the more immersed you are in those different kinds of understanding, the more you can connect with what the storyteller is trying to say, and usually, through that, the more you can appreciate what the story is about. And Japan, because we're going to concentrate on Japanese storytelling because of Godzilla Minus One, Japan, being an island nation, has various kinds of cultural subtexts that are put into almost all of its stories, which Westerners really don't get. Just to give a very bland example, if you had a story about a school-aged person and they went home for lunch in North America, you would consider that not to be anything significant whatsoever. But if you did that in Japan, that person would be considered a delinquent because of the cultural subtext. And that cultural subtext would be in there very specifically to let you know the rebellious nature of this person and how they are very much out of tune with what normal society would expect. And because many stories focus on, or at the very least, use heavily this secondary language of cultural significance for this island nation, as I said, it is very difficult at times for Westerners to understand exactly what is going on. But the secondary point is what draws me in this week. The secondary point is the fact that I believe Godzilla Minus One is a story that reaches out of that cultural subtext, even though there is cultural subtext there, It reaches out of that cultural subtext and touches the human part of every one of us, something deep down that every last human being shares. And that's one of the reasons why I didn't want to do a video on what's Eastern storytelling versus Western storytelling, focusing on the differences that are cultural, because what I really want to focus on and do within my discussions of storytelling is the fact that every last human being has an essential nature that is common to us all, and if you can appeal to that within storytelling, you're telling the best kind of story because you're appealing to something fundamentally human. And that is exactly what Godzilla Minus One does. And I'm going to base what I say about the movie itself next upon statements from the writer/director of this movie itself. And I think the best example of what I'm talking about was expressed by the writer-director when he talked about the origins of why he wanted to use Godzilla to begin with. Because if you listen to a bunch of reviews that are North American reviews of Godzilla Minus One, I have heard more than a few movie reviewers say that even though this is a Japanese film with Japanese sentiments being expressed, they felt like the story was expressing a deeply Christian message. And the point is that if you read or listen to what the writer had to say, he says something quite different. He says that Godzilla is being used here in a Shintoist and an animist kind of way, a very distinctly Japanese Shintoist and animist kind of way. Whereas Godzilla is the embodiment of a personal and at the same time cultural negativity, where that negativity itself takes form. But again, the point being that since people from North America are seeing their own cultural and religious traditions reflected in this story that is based upon something completely different, we know that, or at the very least can surmise that, what the story is doing is reaching back into something deeper, something much more human that can connect to various traditions at the same time. And by the way, just to let you know, when I say very human, I'm not talking about humanist. Quite the opposite. I'm talking about something much deeper, something much more inclusive, as it were, that would include the physical and the spiritual as well as mental whole of a human being, not just a physical body, but a human nature as well. And this ability to use these, what are essentially cultural characteristics of Japanese understanding in such a way that they are so deep that they can connect to human beings and human understandings of various different traditions is exactly the reason why this movie is both poking Hollywood in the eye and why I think it has now cemented the Godzilla legacy for at least 2 to 3 decades to come. Because, very briefly, because I want to get back to the movie itself, right now, Hollywood is doing the exact opposite of what I have just described. They are using things like identity politics, which break people down into very specific sections and says that they have no real connection to each other and therefore cannot really understand each other. This has become readily apparent in the last couple of weeks, where one of the largest entertainment producers, being the Disney company, had to admit in court filings to try to cover its bases from getting sued by its own investors, that it has, for the last number of years, produced entertainment that it states was not in line with its audience's expectations. And why have they been doing so? Well, within the interview that I covered about Bob Iger a couple of weeks ago on my channel, he specifically states they're doing so under his direction because of, and he states this several times, because of diversity and inclusion, which are identity politics buzzwords. And not only that, but he very specifically tells a story about the fact that he was personally the one who got the Black Panther movie made to begin with, because this is the kind of thing he wanted the stories to focus on. And the Black Panther movies are very specifically, even though you might like them, they might be appealing to you in some way, they're based upon ideas of Afrofuturism, which have founding documents stating that you have different races, basically dark-skinned and light-skinned, and while they might be moving in the same direction in a line, they each are in, as the book states, their own trench, which never intersect with each other. Therefore, they're moving on their own in the same direction, but can never intersect, can never understand each other. And funny enough, another connection between that was made just this week, because in that Bob Iger interview that I covered, Iger himself was talking about how the ideas of Ta-Nehisi Coates, one of the writers for the comics of Black Panther, very much informed the making of that movie. Ta-Nehisi Coates is a follower of the ideas of Ibram X. Kendi, and Ibram X. Kendi just had a documentary, and I'll put that in quotes, released on Netflix over the last week, and did interviews talking about the fact that white people are separated off from the rest of the human race. Because of whiteness, they cannot connect with the rest of the human race. In his words, he says, they think of themselves as superior and therefore have no real connection with the rest of the human race. By the way, this is based upon his ideas of whiteness, which is something that you can never change and can never get away from. If you are born with white skin, you have whiteness, which is a privilege, which is connected back to the Marxist idea of whiteness is equated to owning property from the very moment that you are born, and therefore you are one of the property-owning classes. That's where his ideas come from, just to let you know. But the whole point of what he stated in that interview is the fact that there are a certain number of people, a certain class of people, a certain race of people that cannot connect to the rest of the human race, cannot understand what the rest of the human race is going through, what they think, what they feel, anything. And they can never do so because of something like the color of their skin, which leads to statements like in his book where he says, the only cure for past discrimination is current discrimination, and the only cure for current discrimination is future discrimination. And again, this person has a major program out on Netflix this week and is very much ensconced within the Hollywood entertainment system. But enough of that, except to say that this is the kind of idea that is being pushed by Hollywood right now, and its stories, and it is diametrically opposed to the ideas expressed in a subconscious or even instinctual way by Godzilla -1, which is to say, it is an international film, it appeals to an international audience, and the writer, producer of this film intended it to do so, and his intent is based upon the idea that he can connect to all of the human race, that there is something essential within all humanity which can allow him to do so. And that humanity, which he ties specifically into, is the idea of family, the ideas of desperation, and the ideas of what I'm always going on about, which is the core essentials of a heroic nature, which are the virtues that all human beings can express. And what virtue is he stating that he is focusing on? He says he's focusing on fortitude. He's focusing on, as it is translated usually in the interviews, perseverance and bravery. And these are all things that Hollywood shuns right now. Even though the family that he is portraying is certainly not a traditional family. Why? Because it is really simply three individuals that have come together to help each other, a man, a woman, and a child. They are not brought together by the traditional norms of marriage or child rearing, but at the same time, it is a traditional family unit, and the director does talk about this trio as a family. And it's very much the portrayal of, and I ironically use this description because we're talking about a Godzilla movie here, but it is the portrayal of a nuclear family, a man, a woman, and a child. And each of those three take up the traditional role of each of those characters within this story. The man is the protector. The woman is the caregiver. The child is a child. That touches a core essential of humanity within each of us and is heightened by the secondary thing which I talked about, which is desperation. And quite honestly, this theme of desperation, which is very much overlaid on top of this atomic family, because you have this man, the really central character of the movie, trying to do everything that he can to protect this family. But that desperation is there, and it also brings out those themes I talked about at the first, wherein it is expressing something that is very much Japanese, but can be interpreted in various different ways by various different audiences because it's leaning back on something fundamentally human. As the director talks about, He is not so much presenting an anti-government stance, but a stance which basically says, I'm setting this story in this very specific time and place because in that time and place, there was no government. The director, writer of the movie says that he has become basically, and this is my word, disenchanted with the ideas of the government over the last number of years because they simply weren't there for the people. And that's why he sets this movie in this very specific place and time. It's because there was no government at that place and time, and therefore the individuals, as individuals themselves, and banding together as groups of individuals, needed to deal with these problems. Problems, of course, that are so intense and raw that they come from a place of desperation. And the reason why I would say this is interpreted differently by different cultures, even though it is being sparked by a common understanding, is, again, going back to the ideas of Shintoism, which the director is trying to express, saying that Godzilla is, in effect, a representation of the negativity of the individuals and those individuals as a group, the nation as a whole. And so those individuals need to make that individual choice for positivity to counter that negativity, and then join that positivity of the individual together as a group in order to counter the monstrous negativity that is embodied within Godzilla itself. Now, Eastern cultures, like Japan, would focus much more on the Shintoist aspect of this and its collection together to wipe out this negativity, where Western cultures, I would say, would either focus more on, or at the very least give equal focus to, the ideas of the individual choices and the individuals themselves as balanced out with the joining together as groups of individuals in order to combat this evil. But again, the point being is that this idea can be interpreted in various different ways, which touches an essential core of humanity. And once again, this squarely pokes Hollywood in the eye because its ideas, like Ibram X. Kendi's anti-racism, like the origins of the current use of the words diversity and inclusion, they're all traced back to critical theory of one kind or another, and critical theory is based upon a continuous idea of negativity. It is a destructive force in itself, which is meant to criticize in every way, without any constructive criticism ever entering into it, to criticize the fundamental principles of the North American and European, so Western civilization itself, until it chips away little by little with this constant and relentless criticism at the legs that underpin that Western civilization, so it topples and is destroyed. This is the basis of mainstream entertainment storytelling within almost every genre, almost every form of entertainment, Western entertainment right now. And the uplifting idea expressed within Godzilla -1 is that within this almost hopeless amount of destruction and negativity, the human spirit can endure, and not only endure, but defeat that negativity and build something good and new. And last but not least, I'm going to talk about Godzilla himself. When listening to the writer-director of Godzilla -1 talk about Godzilla, he is once again expressing ideas that various cultures can get behind. The whole idea of a monster movie, what is a monster? Well, within Western storytelling, the word monster itself, if I remember correctly, goes back to the Latin, and the word itself means to display. So a monster is a display of the most despicable parts of usually humanity. And that is exactly what the writer-director of Godzilla -1 states about his use of Godzilla. Godzilla is a representation, a physical representation of war and nuclear destruction. And as I said, that physical representation is manifested through the negativity of the people themselves. We very much, in Western society, have an equivalent to this monster. You look at the old stories of Ares, the god of war. The poetic way of the Greeks and the Latins to express the movement of the god of war is that as he walked across the countryside, death and destruction were his wake, and his two children of fear and panic quickly followed after him. This is the idea of Godzilla within this movie. This is the presence of Godzilla within this movie. A physical manifestation of the destruction of war, of the true devastation of atomic power, which, by the way, the director, I would say, masterfully deals with, because there is, again, that cultural understanding of nuclear destruction in Japan that doesn't exist really anywhere else. And all of that pain, destruction, devastation of war is in itself multiplied by having to fight Godzilla from the wreckage of war itself, where nothing is left, and is fed by the negativity of hopelessness itself. And all of that is countered in this story by the human virtue of fortitude. As the director says, the perseverance and bravery of each of these individuals ready to act in a positive way to defend against this monstrous thing, even though they know that as a tiny little individual, human being in this case, they can do nothing on their own. There is no way that any one person can defeat Godzilla. And once again, it comes back to the fundamental idea that bravery and perseverance, that fortitude, is something that connects all of those individuals in a basic human way, that they can join themselves together for the good of themselves and of those around them. And the cherry on top of this heroic triumph of the human spirit is the fact that, number one, the writer-director himself is not only paying homage to the original ideas of Godzilla from the 1952 movie, which was the first movie, but he is also using various great cinematic experiences of the West, movies like Jaws, to inform his storytelling and to create this masterpiece, really, of heroic triumph. And number two being the fact that in describing his story and his storytelling method, we can see that this movie was produced not with a message, not with an agenda to destroy the Hollywood entertainment machine that exists right now, but it is nonetheless doing so by simply concentrating on a good story and the humanity within us all. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this, and don't forget, there are 2 links in the description and the pinned comment for my 3 graphic novels, 2 superhero graphic novels, and a low fantasy sword and sorcery graphic novel. It is my intent, always as a storyteller, to go back to, like Godzilla -1, simply good storytelling in order to appeal to my audience. So if any of that looks or sounds appealing to you at all, click on one of those links and go on over and order yourself a copy of one of my graphic novels today. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.